Two hooded teenagers opened fire at an elementary school and gunned down at least 10 people in Sao Paulo. The motive for the shooting remains unknown for now. Schools fear dead in Lagos as a three-story building collapses while classes were in session. Around 100 children are feared to be trapped inside. And British lawmakers gear up to vote on whether to remove a no-deal Brexit scenario from the table. This after Theresa May's agreement was overwhelmingly rejected. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. First, at least 10 people have been killed at an elementary school in Brazil. This after two hooded teenagers opened fire before taking their own lives. The shooting took place in a suburb of Sao Paulo. The motive for the shooting is currently unknown. For more on the story, we can go across to our correspondent Catherine Osborne in Rio for us. Catherine, what more details do we have for now?
Police say that the two young men, who appear to be in their early 20s, entered the school around 9 o'clock on Wednesday morning. They first shot at a local car wash that was near the school, then entered the school. It was a public school. They opened fire on the inside, shooting staffers of the school and students, and then eventually committing suicide on the inside. And really, in the hours since, authorities have been surrounding the area and trying to make sure victims are being attended to, people who need hospital care are being seen, and also the area is secure because police have said they found an explosive in the backpack of the two young men. And this has really highlighted the fact that school shootings, which are not as common in Brazil as places like the United States, for example, have occurred with more frequency over the past decade. This is the first one like this year, but they've been about one per year over the past decade. The last big one was in 2017 in Goiás, in a more rural area. And it's also unquestionably going to bring up some questions about gun control and the fact that the new administration wants to make it easier for people to access firearms. That's the Bolsonaro administration. They've already passed a decree making it easier for you to buy a gun. So the question of how these men got the gun and what their motive was will be discussed here over the coming days.
Indeed. Thank you very much for the update, Catherine. Catherine Osborne reporting there for us. Now, rescue efforts are underway in the Nigerian city of Lagos. This after a three-story building collapsed while classes were in session. Around 100 children are feared to be trapped inside. Selena Sykes reports.
A frantic search through piles of rubble and twisted metal. Onlookers, including worried parents, crowd around after the collapse of a building containing a primary school in the Nigerian capital, Lagos. Emergency teams and civilians sift through the wreckage for survivors. Cheers erupt as a young boy is pulled out alive, but many more are still feared to be trapped.
At least some people have been rescued and taken to the hospital. There are some still inside that we are trying to rescue out.
The school was on the top floor of a three-story building on Lagos Island. It is also believed to contain a number of apartments. Building collapses are common in Nigeria. The enforcement of regulations is lax, and poor construction materials are often used.
16 days to go until Brexit, and we still do not know if the UK will be leaving the bloc with or without a deal. Last night in Westminster, lawmakers overwhelmingly rejected the Prime Minister's Brexit deal for the second time. Later today, they will be voting on whether to remove the no-deal scenario from the table, a gesture which is likely to pass before a vote, delaying Article 50 on Thursday. For more on the story, we can bring in our international affairs editor, Philip Turrell. Good evening, Philip.
Good evening, Delano.
The vote tonight is largely symbolic, isn't it?
Well, it is and it isn't. It's symbolic because Theresa May suffered another humiliating defeat yesterday. If her deal had gone through yesterday, as she hoped, but many people thought it wouldn't, and it didn't, then Britain would have left the EU on time on the 29th of March, which is just 16 days away. As a result, that deal was rejected for the second time, having already been rejected in January. So now there are two other votes taking place. One today, which is to take a no deal off the table. That means that, in other words, it will make it much more difficult for the United Kingdom to leave the EU without a deal. The problem, as far as that is concerned, is that that's been one of the bargaining chips of Theresa May, saying, vote for my deal, because if we have a no deal, that will be far worse for the UK than the deal that I have managed to arrange with the European Union. So it will put her in a slightly weaker position afterwards. If that is accepted and the no deal is removed as a possibility, then there will be another vote tomorrow, that's Thursday, on whether or not to extend Article 50. What is Article 50? That is the negotiating period of 2 years that comes to an end on the 29th of March, and after that date, Britain is due to leave the EU. But that raises another question, Delano, and that is the EU going to agree to extend Article 50? Because it's not just a unilateral British decision, it has to come from the 27 other members of the EU who have to agree that Britain should be given more time to negotiate something. But as Michel Barnier, the chief negotiator in Brussels, said earlier today, well, we know what you don't want. You don't want Theresa May's deal. What do you want? And until you tell us what you do want, we're not going to be able to extend Article 50.
Because what I find interesting is that you have figures within the Conservative Party, like Boris Johnson, for instance, who seem to think that now's the time to get a better deal from the EU, when Britain has its back against the wall, quite literally.
Well, the EU has said there is no other deal. And even Michel Barnier, standing in the EU Parliament, waved a 500 or so page deal and said, this is it. You know, we're not going to negotiate another deal. We've done all we possibly can. It was you who wanted to leave the EU. It's not the EU who are pushing you out. And every time we offer you something and it doesn't go through the Parliament in London, you come back and say, you're being intransigent. Why won't you give us what we want? So as far as the EU is concerned, that deal is final. But many people in London seem to think, well, if we push them to the limit, there'll be a deal at the 11th hour and we'll have a better Brexit deal. But that is far from certain. In the meantime, Theresa May is sandwiched between those who want a softer Brexit, those who want a hard Brexit. And she might even try and bring back her deal one more time to see if she can vote it through the House of Commons.
We'll see what happens. If you're working tomorrow, I have a feeling we'll be talking about Act 3, the third
I think we might well be.
Maybe. Thank you very much for that, Philip Turl there. In other news, he was once the third most powerful official in the Vatican, and now Cardinal George Pell has been sentenced to 6 years behind bars for sexually abusing 2 boys in Australia in the 1990s. Now, when delivering his sentence, the judge told the 77-year-old that he had abused his position of power and showed no remorse for his crimes. Owen Barnell reports.
Prime Minister!
Mr. Speaker, it may be to the benefit of the House, and I'm sure people will recognize.
We don't have audio.
George Pell.
Cardinal Pell, would you please stand? I sentence you to a total effective sentence of 6 years imprisonment. I set a non-parole period of 3 years and 8 months.
Cardinal Pell was convicted last month on 5 charges of child sexual assault in the 1990s. One of the 5, sexual penetration of a minor. Each charge carried a maximum penalty of 10 years imprisonment. The judge rejected Pell's legal team's defence that if the offending had occurred, it meant the Cardinal had experienced a moment of irrationality. Protesters picketed Melbourne's County Court on Wednesday. During the celebrations after the sentence, a statement was read out on behalf of one of the survivors.
I respect what the judge said. It was meticulous and it was considered. It is hard for me to allow myself to feel the gravity of this moment.
The sexual abuse scandal gripping the Catholic Church is seeing cardinals around the world land in the dock. Yet Pell is the biggest scalp yet. The cardinal once managed the Vatican's finances and was one of the Pope's closest confidants. Pell has lodged an appeal. It will be heard in June.
Protests continue in Algeria days after the ailing president scrapped the next month's election and announced he won't be seeking a 5th mandate. Pressure is mounting on Abdelaziz Bouteflika and those around him to pave the way out of the political deadlock. Protesters are calling for mass demonstrations to take place this Friday. It would mark 4 weeks of anger pouring out onto the streets. The man tasked with overseeing the political transition in the country has been speaking to local television. Here's what Lakhdar Brahimi had to say on the president's mental capacity.
President Bouteflika, of course, can't give speeches on television or in public. That is a result of the illness. But his mental capacity is there at 100%, not at 90%. but at 100%.
The United Nations has drawn up a humanitarian response plan for the Syrian crisis, this following the 8-year conflict which has left over 360,000 people dead and displaced 6.2 million others. Now, the United Nations and the EU are co-chairing the third conference on the supporting the future of Syria and the region in Brussels. Earlier, we spoke to Panos Moumtsis, Assistant Secretary General and the UN Regional Coordinator for the Syrian crisis, on how close the UN was to reaching its target of $3.3 billion.
There are massive humanitarian needs still inside Syria, almost 12 million people in need. More than 6 million internally displaced, 5.5 million refugees in the neighboring countries. So there's still massive needs throughout the country. And of course, every support from governments, from donors is absolutely needed to continue providing life-saving assistance to millions of Syrians who still find themselves in need of support and are not able to stand on their own feet to cover the needs.
So which sector needs the most immediate attention? Is it food or shelter?
The one issue that Syrians always bring up is really the question of safety, protection, to be able to make sure that they're safe where they are. Now, there are really massive needs on all areas. Food is very significant. Health is also important. Education is really important. At the moment, there is more than 2 million children in Syria that are out of school. These kids should be in school. And for us to be able really to respond in all areas, both in government areas, but also in non-government areas, but there's also massive needs on the ground.
Now, in your report, you say you need around $200 million to address education needs. How do you go about educating children who've never seen the inside of a school?
Oh, one really has to put in place support, a school, child-friendly places, psychosocial support. Syria is a country where millions of children have gone through really traumatic experiences. So being able to provide them a safe environment, to provide them the bare minimum, a school, some stability, to really give them an equal opportunity of a future like every other child in the world is vital. So I think that this money is not just education, it's really money into funds, support to future peace and stability for the country itself and for the next generation, and to give them equal opportunities.
And what are the immediate risks if you aren't able to get all the money you need, the $3.3 billion?
Well, the risk is, of course, is not to be able to provide these very bare minimum life-saving services to people who are desperately in need and dependent on humanitarian assistance. So, for example, we will not be able to provide food, not to be able to provide shelter. At the moment, there is displacement happening as we speak. We have received just in the last few weeks more than 50,000 people from the ISIL-liberated areas who came to Al-Holqa. We've had displaced people in the northwest. We have people who really live in a refugee kind of situation and who entirely depend on international support until a solution comes, until a way forward is found. So I think I very much appeal to governments, I appeal to the private sector, I appeal to really everybody to be able to come forward with the financial support that is urgently needed to help us to support Syrians through 2019, while, of course, we all hope to see more peace and stability inside Syria and less hostilities to ensure protection of civilians and to ensure that the basic needs of people are actually met.
Now, you said people continue to be displaced in the country. We do know that, but there have been UN programs to repatriate refugees. How are those going?
So in 2018, last year, we had about 1.4 million Syrians, mainly from within Syria, internally displaced, who went back spontaneously on their own. There were at least 57,000 that the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees have registered of return from the neighboring countries, from Jordan, from Lebanon, from Turkey. So people who on their own decide to return, we help them in areas of the return. Our position remains that the conditions inside Syria are not conducive for return. And therefore, as United Nations, we don't promote, we don't facilitate, we don't encourage return. Should people decide to return, of course, assistance will be given in their homes, in towns, villages, both in terms of rehabilitating schools, but also providing the bare minimum life-saving assistance to help them in the places where they have returned.
That's it from me, from all of us on the team. Thank you very much for watching.